All right, good evening, First Baptist Church. How y'all doing this evening? Let's start that again. How y'all doing this evening? Oh, there you go. All right, if you wouldn't stand, I'll sing a couple of worship songs. You should enjoy this. I heard an old story, how a Savior came from glory, how he gave his life on Calvary to save a wretch like me. I heard about his groaning, of his precious blood atoning. Then I repented of my sins and won the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and he bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is to him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood. I heard about a mansion he has built for me in glory, and I heard about the streets of gold beyond the crystal sea, about the angels singing and the old redemption story. And some sweet day I'll sing up there the song of victory. Lift it up. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and he bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is to him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood. Man, y'all sound good.
Lord, I come, I confess, bowing here, I find my rest. Without you, I fall apart. You're the one who guides me. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Where sin runs deep, your grace is more. Where grace is found is where you are. Where you are, Lord, I am free. Holiness is Christ in me. Lord, I So teach my soul to rise to you when temptation comes my way. When I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. When I cannot stand, and when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. You're my one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Amen. Y'all can have a seat.
All right, good evening. Good to see everybody tonight on this torrential rainstorm that we're having here in Texas. I'm thankful for the rain. Actually, it's a beautiful evening. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles tonight. We're going to, turn to chapter 23, but don't read chapter 23. So Chris shared with you last week. He taught last week, and it was a lot of fun. If you remember that, his topic was polygamy, rape, and murder, and how long you can impale somebody and leave them on the stick. And so I decided I want to wrap up Deuteronomy. We're in chapter 23. If you remember, Moses is in his final speech, and so all of Deuteronomy basically is a speech of Moses. And the moment he finishes the speech, he's going to go up on Mount Pisgah, which we're going to see tonight. God's going to show him the Holy Land, the Promised Land, and then he's going to die. So we're going to complete Deuteronomy tonight. I went through chapters 23 through 34. We're going to read chapter 34 in its entirety. But the rest of the chapters I looked at, and as Chris shared with you last week and I've shared with you before, his speech is a summary. It's a reminder of all that's been taught in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. And so we have dealt with most of it already before. However, in chapters 23 through 33, there are some interesting passages. Now, some of them I can't even share in church. But there are other interesting passages that I can share. So look with me in chapter 23. We'll look in verse 7 and 8. Again, don't read the previous ones, but 7 and 8. Focus on that. Deuteronomy 23, 7 and 8. Again, these are all miscellaneous directives about life, relationships, diseases, social justice, and finances primarily. It's how to get along with your neighbor and how to survive in this world, and what does God consider appropriate and what's inappropriate behavior. So Deuteronomy 23, 7. Do not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. Do not abhor an Egyptian, because you lived as an alien in his country. The third generation of children born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord. Now this is really spectacular for a couple of reasons. First of all, he says, don't abhor an Edomite. Now, I didn't read for you other verses previous to this, I think, or right around this, that talk about certain others that they can abhor, that will never be allowed into the assembly of the Lord. But these two he makes an exception of and specifically mentions them. So why are they not to abhor an Edomite? How are they their brother? Yeah, so Edom is another name for Esau, who was the brother of Jacob. Now, the Edomites didn't treat them so good when they came through. They weren't very neighborly, but God still says that even though they weren't very neighborly, they are your kin. They are your brothers, and so you don't hate them. And then he talks about, and this is the really shocking part, he talks about another group that they're to accept, and who is it? Egyptians. He says, because you lived as an alien in his country, the Egyptians' country. So if you remember, I would think that they would say, or God would say, but you can't hate the Egyptians because they what? They enslaved you for 400 years. They treated you terribly. They killed many of you. And yet God says, no, actually, I want you to not hate them. Because you were there. There was a time, and God sees time in its totality. There was a time where the Egyptians treated them fairly. In the time of Joseph, who was raised in power up to the second most powerful in the country, second only to the Pharaoh. And so there was a time where they were accepted and revered in Egypt. And so God, perhaps remembering that time, and says, don't hate them. And then he says in verse 8, even more amazingly, the third generation of children born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord. That is, if an Edomite comes in to the promised land, if an Egyptian comes in as an alien in the promised land and wants to become a Jew, wants to become a God-fearer, and from that become a Jew, they're allowed to do that. That process takes basically 3 generations, and they can become a part of the Israelites. That's extraordinary to me. Next, look in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 5. The next chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 5. So, before I read this, in our own country, I think there are people that we don't like. I guarantee there are people that we don't like. Every day when I drive through Metroplex traffic, I'm reminded of that. We went to San Antonio yesterday, Cherry and I, to go see our daughter. Last night, she flew out early this morning for survival training in the Air Force in Seattle. And apparently that whole West Coast is so rough right now that they send them to the West Coast for their survival training. So she's in Seattle, and we came back, and the traffic yesterday was horrible. We went down through rush hour, and the GPS lady, don't trust her. She sent us right through Austin during rush hour, and it was a nightmare. And people aren't very nice sometimes in how they drive and how they gesture you and that sort of thing. And there are people that you and I just want to abhor. You know, I'm praying about some of them, and not good prayers either. I'm not asking God to save them. I'm asking Him to do something else, because people just make us very angry. And in our culture, as we watch the news and watch certain newscasters and certain members of our government, and we just become angry, every word they say just infuriates us. What if you were to hear from God, I don't want you to hate them. I want you to love them. I want you to try to find a way to include them. Those are hard words, are they not? I tell you, love your enemies. You have heard it said of old, love your enemies, but love your friends and hate your enemies, or love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, Jesus says to love your enemy. In other words, you love your friends and your enemies. You love everybody. Those are hard words. This is a good lesson for them. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 5. If a man has recently married, I put this in there just because I thought it was funny. If a man has recently married, he must not be sent to war or have any other duty laid on him. For 1 year, he's to be free to stay at home and bring happiness to the wife he's married. How about that, men? You don't even have to fight for a year. You have one goal, men, and that's to make your wife happy. It's more important, they decide, to make the wife happy than to defend the nation because the family was very important. I just found that very interesting. You get 1 year, make her happy for a year. And if you've been married more than a year, don't sit there and think, well, I don't have to do that anymore. No, that's not what he says. That's not what they mean by that. But she's guaranteed at least one happy year before you run off and fight. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 1. The next chapter, verse 1. Again, I just find these passages interesting. I'm not sure how to apply this to you. I just thought it was interesting. When men have a dispute, which is, by the way, quite often men, they are to take it to court and the judges will decide the case, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. If the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make him lie down and have him flogged in his presence with the number of lashes his crime deserves, but he must not give him more than 40 lashes. If he is flogged more than that, your brother will be degraded in your eyes. Now, this is one of those kind of rare occasions in the law where the punishment is not death. He says if two guys are having a disagreement with each other, bring it to court. We'll find out who's wrong. And if he's wrong, we'll beat him. We'll whoop him. And depending on how wrong he is, will dictate how much of a whooping he will get. And so how many lashes can he get? What's the maximum? No more than 40. Because if he gets more than 40, what happens? Well, he'll die, but he doesn't mention that here. Well, what does it say here? He'll be degraded in your eyes. Well, I had to look that one up. Here's what one commentary said. When an offender was found guilty and sentenced to be beaten, he was not to be humiliated, but punished justly. To beat him too little would be to minimize the offense, but to beat him too much would be to treat him in an inhumane manner and degrade him. The limit was 40 stripes, but the Jews later made it 39. We see that in 2 Corinthians 11:24. So as not to accidentally go over the legal number. So I've always heard 39 lashes, and I've always believed that the reason they whip you 39 lashes because 40 lashes will kill you. Now, you may be dead on 31 or 61. Probably different for different people, but the reason for 39 lashes, and I never knew this, I didn't remember this passage until I studied this week. The reason for 39 lashes was because any more than 40 was a humiliation to him. And then by the time the New Testament came along, they became very ritualistic and legalistic, and they didn't want to break the law, because some of them are better at counting than others. And they thought, well, just in case Bob over here, he's whooping somebody and he's not very good with math, we better back it up to 39 so that he gets it under the legal limit. So, and so if you ever heard why people are whipped in the Bible with 39 lashes, particularly in the New Testament, that's why. It's 39, not 40. And the 40 comes from right here. Okay, again, I don't have a lot of application for that, but I just found that interesting. Okay, all right. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5. I've never heard of anything like this quite in history, so let's go. Deuteronomy 25:5. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. And the duty of a brother-in-law to her is to give her a son on behalf of the dead brother. Verse 6, the first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. Well, that kind of makes sense, does it not? So what they're trying to do, is to keep the family names from dying out. That makes sense. It's an interesting solution to that particular problem, but that's what you would do if your brother dies and he's married and they don't have any kids. Guess what? You get to marry her. Unless verse 7. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I don't want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. Now, I can explain none of that. It's just a ritual that they went through. So, ladies, if you get rejected by your brother-in-law, you can at least spit in his face and take his sandal off and hit him with a sandal. I don't know. Okay. Now, chapters 27 through 30 are about blessings and curses. And we've already talked about much of that material, or most of it, but you can go through and read about blessings and curses. In fact, I think one of my lessons was entitled Blessings and Curses. And he's basically saying, again, I know we've looked at this, if you do what's right, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to bless you, and all the peoples of the world are going to be envious of you, and you're going to be protected, and you don't have to fear anybody. If you're not faithful to me, all these horrible things are going to happen to you. And so that's what he's telling them. But if you look in Deuteronomy 31:7, Deuteronomy 31:7. Deuteronomy 31:7. Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the presence of all of Israel, be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to give their forefathers to give them. And you must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. That mandate is also given in around this passage directly from God himself. And so it's mentioned twice, once by God and once here by Moses. And so he's trying to challenge and encourage Joshua and with these promises to not be afraid because God will be with him. Famous statements there. Those are good passages or good verses to memorize. Deuteronomy 31:7 and 8. Now look with me in chapter 31, just a little bit further down in verse 24. Now this is Moses. Again, he's getting to the end of his speech, and you can hear the frustration in his voice. After Moses finished writing in a book the words of this law, so this is a summary, now that he's finished writing all these words from beginning to end, he gave this command to the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Take this book of the law and place it beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God. There it will remain as a witness against you. For I know how this is Moses speaking, for I know how rebellious and stiff-necked you are. If you have been rebellious against the Lord while I am still alive and with you, how much will you rebel after I die? Now, parents, you probably felt this frustration with your kids at one point or another. If your kids rebelled while they were at home, and then they move out of the house when they grow up, you're thinking to yourself, oh, no, I'm not going to be around anymore to gripe them out. And Moses says, if you were that bad when I was here, imagine what you're going to do when I'm dead. And he doesn't have a whole lot of optimism does he? In fact, he simply says this, that he wrote all of this law under God's directive, puts it right there beside the ark. He says it's going to be here not as a testimony for you, but a testimony against you. This is going to be what's going to condemn you because you're bad, bad people. You've been bad, and I think he's still mad that he's not going to get into the Holy Land. He still blames them, and I can only imagine what you're going to do as soon as I'm dead. So Moses definitely does not go quietly into the night. He wants to leave with a bang. Interestingly, and I'm not going to read it, it's just way too long, but it is interesting, so when you have time, go to chapter 32. Moses writes a song. It's a pretty long song too. It won't make the top 10, but it's a long song. It's called the Song of Moses in chapter 32. And also the blessing of Moses. Moses does do a blessing in chapter 33, and so you'll want to read that. Any comments about any of this before we move on to the final chapter? Okay, all right. Chapter 34, verse 1. We're going to read the entire chapter, and then we'll talk about it. Deuteronomy chapter 34. This is the final chapter in Deuteronomy. Then Moses climbed at Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross over into it." And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite of Beth Peor. But to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those miraculous signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all of his officials, and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Now, a couple of things, and then there's an epitaph here, an extra note that is also historically amazing and interesting concerning Moses. Back at the beginning of chapter 34, we see Moses climb Mount Nebo and then to the top of Pisgah, Mount Pisgah. And it specifically says it's across from where? From Jericho. Now, if you recall, Jericho was going to be the beginning of the conquering of Israel. It's where they go around Jericho. They march around it 7 times, and on the last day, I think they march around once a day. And then on the last day, I think it's 7 trips around, and then God just causes the walls to collapse. It's a great story, and we'll get to that in the weeks to come. Moses can see that. He can see Jericho. By the way, Jericho is the oldest continually inhabited city in the world. Because even when it was destroyed, there were people still living around in the area. It was eventually, buildings were eventually rebuilt, and it continued to be inhabited. So it's a very, 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 very ancient city. It was a reasonably, a well-established city, let me put it that way, even in the day of Moses. And so he goes up and he can see Jericho. I've walked in Jericho. I've eaten in the restaurants of Jericho. And there's not a whole lot there. I mean, there's not a lot of greenery there. But it is a fascinating place. There's a modern city, well, compared to the ruins of Jericho. But so he goes up on that mountain. And he sees that. God gives him this kind of supernatural ability to see the whole of Israel. Either that or it was a really, really, really clear day. I think it was a little of both. But Moses is able to, and Israel's not a very wide country, by the way, but he's able to see all of Israel. God reveals it to him. And then he reminds him, you're not going to go. And then secondly, I want you to notice this. Verse 9. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. You know, parents, I told you when your kids go to college and you may think, oh no, they're going to fall off the deep end. What do you do as a parent? Do you throw up your hands and give up? No, what you do is you try your best before they leave to put the fear of God into them. And that's what Moses did. And at least for a while, it appears to have worked. Because they could have immediately, the next day when Moses is gone, they could have just started rebelling and partying, and it could have all come to nothing right there. But they don't do that. Instead, they actually accept the leadership of Joshua, and they listen to him, it says. Then a nice little description there in verse 10 and 11 and 12 about the kind of person that Moses was in conclusion. So God gave Moses the ability to view the whole land. Naphtali in the north, Ephraim and Manasseh in the central area, and then Judah, the Negev, and Zoar in the south. God assured Moses that he would keep his covenant with the patriarchs and give Israel this wonderful land. However, this is not the last that we see of Moses in the Bible. We actually see a conversation between Moses and somebody else. Who is it? Do what? Yes, Moses, Elijah, and Christ, and Jesus. So I want to look at that. This is the final words of Moses in the Bible. We don't have his exact sentences, but it's an interesting conversation nonetheless, because we do have a little hint about what they're talking about. Luke chapter 9, verse 28. Would you turn there with me? Luke chapter 9, verse 28. And again, we'll close with this. Don't miss this beautiful passage. Luke chapter 9, verse 28. Luke 9:28. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became bright as a flash of lightning. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke, here's the conversation. They spoke, this is Moses and Elijah, they spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. What is his departure? His crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. So that's the topic of conversation. So Moses and Elijah at this point, because they've been with God in heaven, they're fully versed on the plan. They know what the plan is. Why God chooses to have them come down and have this conversation with Jesus in front of the disciples, only God knows. Except that this must have been quite a moment for those three disciples as they watched this amazing thing happen. And also, Moses, Peter, James, and John, they recognize Moses and Elijah. You know, there's no pictures of them. They've been dead for, over 1,000 years. But God revealed to them that's who that was. It was Moses and Elijah. So they had this conversation. Okay, all right. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Verse 32, Peter and his companions were very sleepy. But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. That's how we know that they recognized who they were, because Peter mentions them by name, offers to put up a tent for them, like there's a tent store there. Anyway, the tent would have been shelters or lean-tos that they would have created with branches. Verse 34, but while he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, this is my son whom I've chosen. Listen to him. Basically, this is God, we interpret this as God saying to Peter, you need to stop talking. You need to shut up. Just don't say anything. This is my son whom I've chosen. Listen to him. Because he interrupted him. Verse 36, when the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. So here's the final moment of Moses here on planet Earth. Again, 1,500 years later. And it's a conversation he has with Elijah and Jesus. All right, any other comments or questions about this? Now, it does tell me that through Christ and through his mercy, that you and I will have the opportunity to speak and converse with Moses and Elijah and all of the patriarchs in time. I look forward to that. Amen? All right, we will conclude that, and next week we will start with the book of Joshua.